In this video, we are going to talk about Npm and external packages. And this is going to set us up so that we can bring in a package that's really common in React called React Router, which will allow us to create multiple pages within our quiz application. So I have Npm's website pulled up. It's npmjs.com. Npm is two things. It is a package registry, and it is a command line tool. So on the package registry side, it's the go-to for JavaScript package management. And you can see a couple popular libraries are here. If I click on one of them, like Express, we can see documentation about this library. We can see how many times it's been downloaded, what version it's on, its homepage, its GitHub repository that we could click through to get to the source code of that library. And it doesn't particularly matter for this example, but Express is a library for server-side programming in JavaScript using Node. This is a code snippet for how to set up Express in that environment on port 3000 to handle HTTP requests and send back hello world. It doesn't matter if that doesn't make sense right now, but the key thing is that these packages are published by different individuals and organizations, and the quality of the page that we're seeing here, the README, is going to be up to that individual. So as you're digging into the world of dependencies and using other people's code in your project, you're going to have to read a lot of documentation. Some of it will be good, like Express has a really great, robust set of documentation on their homepage. So this one's a good one, but you will also encounter ones that have no documentation that you bring in or have out-of-date documentation. So it's going to be part of the process of working with external dependencies. So I said that NPM is two things. It's this centralized collection of libraries, and it is a command line tool. So we've actually been using it as a command line tool, and I've got the documentation pulled up here. It's at docs.npmjs.com. Once you have npm installed on your machine, you're able to run the npm command, and you're able to pass in one of these commands that you want to run, like npm install. We've seen that you can use that to install all of the dependencies in a project. Or npm run here is the same thing as npm run script, which allows us to run a script from the package.json. We'll be looking at two commands in this video. We'll be using npm, let's go back to install here. So if you call npm install with no arguments, it installs all of the packages that it finds in the package.json, but you can also use it to install specific packages. So you can add a new thing to your package JSON and to your project using npm install. And here, if we go back, we can see this in the installation instructions where you pass in the name of the package where this has been registered in the centralized repository here of npm. So we'll use npm install, and we'll probably also take a look at npm uninstall, which has a couple of aliases. So you can just do npm rm or r and uninstall a package that has been installed in your project. So if we flip back to our quiz game that we've been working on, I have the files here from the last video, and we go into package.json, we can see some dependencies in here that we've already been importing and using. We've already imported React into our project and used it in a few components. And our project has a few other dependencies that we haven't used inside of our JavaScript, but it has one React script here that we have been using anytime we run start or build. So these dependencies are dependencies that are resolved in the npm registry. So having them expressed here, when we run npm install, it goes to that registry, pulls these down into our node modules folder so that we can use them. And this doesn't have what are called dev dependencies, but there are usually at least two different types of dependencies that you'll see listed in your package JSON. Dependencies are ones that are intended to be consumed by your code. So we are importing React into our components and using it in our components. And then dev dependencies are dependencies that are intended to be used as part of your build process or used around your code, like in scripts that you might have that automate things in your project. So we're not going to have to worry about dev dependencies just yet, but it's worth noting that you can put dependencies in multiple places in your package JSON. And when we install, we're going to specifically be installing into this dependency section, not into the dev dependencies. So I want to go through the process of installing 2 dependencies into our project, and we'll read the documentation and use that documentation to figure out how to bring those dependencies into our project. The first one that I want to show you, if I go back to Npm and search for Tone, is Tone.js. So this is a web framework for doing interactive music in the browser. We, I think, have looked at this in our class sessions before. And if I go to their homepage here, well, you know what? Actually, I want to go to their URL here that I'm clicking through to their README, then getting to tonejs.github.io. Tone is one of those libraries that has good documentation, so it's telling us an overview of what the library does, allowing us to create synthesizers and all sorts of things using Tone. We install it by npm installing Tone, so this is registered in the npm package registry under the name Tone. Then we import it into our project using this import syntax that's a little bit different than we've used before. And then we're able to do something like here, we're creating a new synthesizer that lives under the Tone namespace synth here. And then we're connecting it to our speakers. So we're doing toDestination on it. So that gives us a synth that we can play notes from, that we can trigger it to play notes that come out of our speaker. And then we can use the synth method trigger attack release here to pass in a specific note. So here, a C4 note that we're playing for 1/8 of a note. So plays for 1/8 of a note here. And we could change these parameters when we bring it into our code. We could play an A note for 1/4 of a note or a whole note. If we keep looking through our documentation here, we can see that trigger attack release is one way that we can have a synth play a note, but we can also trigger attack and release separately. So we can start a C4 note playing at the current time using tone.now, and then tell it to release 1 second in the future. And using that, we can also see here that you can schedule multiple notes. So you can grab the current time, schedule a note with trigger attack release to play at the current time. So a C4 for 1/8 a note. And then we can say now plus 1/2 a second, an E4, and now plus a second, a G4. So just by spending a few minutes reading the documentation, we have a pretty good idea of how to install our package and use it. So we're going to do that now. And one note that I will throw out there, background knowledge, is that the web audio API, you can't do any of these things until you have interacted with the web page. That is to help prevent spam and malicious code from sort of spamming the web audio API. So when we bring this into our project, we'll make sure that we create this synth and trigger it inside of like a button click to make sure that the user has actually interacted with the page, which allows us to use the web audio API. Okay, so this process, flipping back to our application, if we have our server running, we want to make sure to kill that. So I'm hitting Control-C in my terminal window, or I'm going to hit the trash to kill this process. Then we will run npm install. It has an alias of I, so you could do npm I tone. And this will take a second to run. And when it finishes running, we should see in our package.json that a new entry has been added for tone. And here it has been added at version 14.7.77. So at the time of running that, it grabbed the latest version. And if I were to look in my node modules folder here, I should see something under T. Whoops. Oh, I missed it. Here we go. Tone just got installed into my node modules folder. So now that that has finished installing, I can npm run start. And I want to create a new folder here in demos called Dependencies. And we will create a musical button.js. And how I usually do this and how I recommend doing it is just get something showing up on the page, and then we can, once we know that's working, move on to the next thing. So let's have it say something like play. We should be able to go to the app that we were working in before, add a new H2 here, Tone.js music. And we should be able to musical button here, let IntelliSense add our import, which it did. Give this a save, and we've got tone music play that we can click on. And while we're at it, let me introduce the idea of children. So in React, if I were to say something like this, play some beats, and let's throw in headphones. This, whatever we put in between the opening and closing, gets registered as a property called children here. So if I run this and I check out my console, I should see play some beats printing out. And instead of putting play directly in here, I can put children in. And now my button says play some beats, which means that this component is kind of like a button, like a normal HTML button, where we can put the text that we want inside of the opening and closing tags, and that will show up on our page. So I don't think we're going to need 2 musical buttons, but maybe we'll come back and add another. What we want to do is go through that process of bringing in the pieces of the documentation to our project. So we're going to have to import Tone using the import star as tone syntax here. What this does is whatever Tone exports, whatever that library exports, this grabs all of them and makes them available under this sort of namespace Tone. So we can grab the synth by doing tone.synth down here. So let's make sure that we import Tone and that then we do this logic. So we'll import everything as Tone from Tone, all lowercase. And let's create a play music function. And we will create a synth using tone.synth. So this part is constructing our new synth, and then we are chaining onto that the toDestination method of the synth to connect that synth to our speaker. And then once we've done that, we can synth trigger attack release, and we can pass in our note. And let's do a 4th note instead of an 8th note. So we have our function here, and we can set that up so that when the button is clicked, our music should play. So every time we click, we're creating a new synth and setting that note to be scheduled and playing it. So if we go back to our documentation here and look at the more complex example, we saw that if we go ahead and get a reference to tone.now, we can pass that in to schedule notes at different times. So we can schedule something to run immediately and something to run slightly in the future. So we could just set up a couple of notes to run 1 second apart. So getting a reference there, and then we can tell this note to run at now, and let's do one more. Whoops, at now +1, and one more at now +2. And we could change these, like maybe we want to ascend. So let's do C, D, E. Let's add a few more, 4, 5 here, and let's keep going up. And then maybe to the C, whoops, C5. Oh, I might have messed up the sequence here. No, that looks fine. But again, we can change any of these if we want. If we didn't like that sequence, we can come in and change the notes here and change the time signature and change the scheduling. All of that, if you want to do, you just dig into the library documentation. Like maybe it would be a cool extension to accept these notes as an array as a prop, so that you could create musical buttons here, one that plays through ascending notes and one that plays through descending notes, all controlled by just passing in an array of notes. What I want to do is go through this process one more time with a new dependency. So I'm going to go ahead and kill my server. And if we had wanted to get rid of Tone, we could do Npm Uninstall Tone, and that would remove it from node modules and remove it from our dependencies. I want to go back to npmjs.com and let's search for ReactConfetti. So ReactConfetti is a little library that actually gives you a React component to trigger confetti particles flying around your page. So we might use this like when the user completes the quiz and gets a high score, maybe we'd throw some confetti on the page. So same deal, we want to read through the documentation to figure out how to use it, and if the documentation fails us, then we want to click over to the source code and we can start digging through and look at how this library is structured. Here, this library is written in TypeScript. But I would be able to start piecing through how the library works if the documentation fails me. Luckily, this one has pretty decent documentation, so it tells us to install ReactConfetti. This is the identifier of the package in the NPM registry. And then it has a little example component that is rendering confetti. And there's a little note that says that width and height are recommended to be passed in. And if they aren't, they will default to the initial window dimensions, but that doesn't respond to resize events. So it might set up your particle system to match this window size currently. But then if I were to resize, those particles would not dynamically resize to match the width and height of the resize browser. That's fine for our purposes. We don't need it to be responsive. So we're going to ignore this because this also involves bringing in another dependency, which I don't want to do just yet. So we're going to create confetti. We can see that we're importing that component from ReactConfetti, and we're importing it with a capital letter because that's our convention in React. And then we can see a list of the properties that this takes. So the width and height we just saw. Number of pieces sounds like it's the number of particles. The confetti source sounds like it is where, what's the sort of shape that the confetti is being emitted from. So here this looks like it is a line from the top left of the page to the top right of the page. And we can scroll over and see the description, rectangle where it spawned, friction, wind, gravity, initial velocity, an array of colors, opacity. And you know what? This table might look better if we actually go to the homepage. Yeah, here, this is a little bit better to look at. So we've got all of these that we can play with, and it's just a matter of reading the documentation. So what I want to do is make sure that we get React Confetti into our project using Npm install, and then let's put it onto a page to make sure that it works. We have no errors, and then we'll explore adding some of these properties in. So let's create a Confetti Demo Js, and let's install React Confetti. This is going to take a second, so while that's running, I am going to import Confetti with a capital C from React Confetti. Create our Confetti demo component and export it and have it return. Let's put this confetti inside of a div. So I'm rendering that external package component here inside of a div. So we can start up our server again and make sure that this confetti demo we actually put on the page, because this is just the definition of the component, but it doesn't actually execute the component. To do that, we would come back in here and let's do confetti demo. And here I am pressing down once and then hitting tab to autocomplete with confetti demo, which will use IntelliSense to import that. If it doesn't on your machine, just make sure that you're actually importing from demos dependencies confetti demo. So this finished compiling, so we can check it out in our browser. You can see that by default, some confetti is dropping down on our page. And let's close this previous tab. If we wanted to change the number of confetti pieces, we could pass in that, and wind and gravity. We could play with some of these. So number of pieces, let's do 2,000. And now a whole lot more are dropping down on the page. Let's have them drop. What did it say the default was here? The default is 0.1. So if we double that, 0.2, these should fall faster. Looks like it's working. And the wind defaults to 0. So we could try wind of 0.25, and now the particles are blowing over to the right. Maybe we'll drop that down to 0.1. 0.5. I don't know, you can just play with those values to find something that you like. So this is great on its own, but we might need a way to toggle the confetti on and off. So if we go back to React Confetti here and look through the props, we can see a run parameter, which controls whether the animation is actually running. And that takes a true or false value. It's a Boolean. So if we say run equals false, that paused our in progress confetti. And if I refresh my page, the confetti doesn't even start. So what we could do is combine this with some of our previous knowledge on how to create state to make a button that turns the confetti on and off. And maybe we could also look at creating some inputs that allow us to configure the actual confetti parameters here. So what I want to do is create a Boolean variable that we can use in place of run. So here I am typing in use state, and then I am looking for the thing that will auto import from React. So when I clicked that, it pulled in from React the use state package, or the use state function. And then let's put is running here. What I can do is open up my DevTools and go to React Confetti. Oh, actually, sorry. Let's. This is the actual underlying component that we can see here. We don't want to really touch this one. We want to use our component, Confetti Demo, and if I change the state here, which you can see I got a checkbox that I can toggle on and off, our confetti is running and stopping. So now what I'd want to do is take that state and let's actually have like a button that we can put here. So I'm going to create a div and put the button in a div, and that's because I want to create an input above the button and make sure that they're on separate lines. So we'll add that in a second. So let's say toggle confetti on click equals, we'll create a function in a second called toggle confetti. And here I'm going to do this in one line. So what we're doing is passing in the opposite of is running. We're using the not operator to flip the Boolean from false to true or true to false here. So we pass that into our set is running function, which should allow us to toggle the confetti on and off here by clicking this button. And you can see the state changing along with it over in my DevTools. Let's go ahead and make this button a little bit more descriptive. We saw before that we could use the ternary conditional operator. So is running. Whoops. If it's running, we'll turn the confetti off. If it's not running, we'll turn the confetti on. So now, based on the state, that button text is changing. And just to review, this is our condition for our ternary conditional operator. If it's true, this is what gets returned and put into button text. If it's false, this is what gets returned and put into button text. And if you want, you can actually do all of this inline in your JavaScript here. I tend to find that too many of these like ternary conditional operators in my markup makes it harder to read the markup. So I will often break this out into a variable or break this out into another component that accepts a property that controls whether it's on or off. Let's also create another piece of state here that is the num particles, set num particles. And here we want to figure out what our default should be. Maybe we'll use 200, which I'm just remembering lines up with what we saw in the documentation. We can use this variable to plug it in here. So now when we turn this on, we shouldn't see as many particles flying down. But if I use my dev tools and change this to 20,000 and hit enter, as soon as that state changes, the confetti is updated. And if I change it to 20, of course, it is changed yet again. So what I want to do is use an input like we did before, give us a little slider here for controlling the number of particles. So creating a div, I want to create a label, and below that create an input of type range. And here I'm using the emit extension that's enabled in Visual Studio by default to expand those. So here I've got an input of type range. I don't need the name for our purposes, but what I do want to do is make sure that when someone clicks the label, it is associated with this input, which helps for accessibility reasons and also is useful for screen readers. So here let's call this the num particles. And we can configure the min and max. So maybe the min we'll say is 1 particle, and the max we'll say is 3,000 particles, and then the step will make it that it only steps in whole numbers. We can set the value using num particles here. So if I do this, when the input is loaded on the page, we should see it somewhere near the min, but not quite at the min. So I just hit refresh to make sure that I was seeing the most recent version. Here it is close to the min, so this looks like it's working. So the other piece of our inputs that we learned was that we want to handle when they're changed, because right now if I try and drag this, nothing happens. Let's call this onParticlesChange, which is going to take an event in. And the event.target.value tells us what the value is. I want to make sure, like we talked about before, that we go from a string, whatever event.target.value is, to a number. Whoops, I have a little syntax error here. So I want to make sure that I've got my event function. So event.target.value here is not guaranteed for us to have in the right format. We want an integer. So we want to make sure that we take this, whatever we're getting, and we parse int. And parse float takes in that single parameter, parse int takes in 2, and the second one is the base of the number. So here we want to make sure that we parse it as base 10, since that is what we think of for integers. So I'm taking our integer thing, our integer variable, and using it to set our state variable here. So putting that all together, on change equals on particles change should trigger that function anytime our input is changed. So we should be able to slide this around. We could verify that with our dev tools by making sure that we look at the component, Confetti demo, and watch its state change over here. So it looks like it's hooked up properly. So we could try testing it, turning that confetti on, sliding it to a ridiculous amount of particles, sliding it back down, turning the confetti off. So it looks like it's working. We could continue going. We could add more inputs here and handle all of the change on those inputs to make sure that we can control like the gravity and the wind here. But this should be enough to demo using that external library and kind of combining it with our state knowledge here with our Boolean state variable and our number state variable. So that's all there is to bringing in dependencies. We just install them from the registry, and then we rely on the package documentation to try to figure out how to use that within our project. Next time, we are going to bring in React Router as an external dependency, which will allow us to create multiple pages in our application, which will allow us to start building our quiz application and start replicating some of the pages we had, like the home page and the about page.